The reason all of us are here and what we're really thinking about is that cities are having kind of a tough time right now. And what we mean by that is that cities are facing numerous challenges and they're all sitting on top of each other. So we could go in depth into any one of these, but we really see them all showing up in this context, particularly in North America, where we have a lot of capital, we have advanced tech capabilities, and we have a lot of goodwill and desire to correct a lot of these problems. Could go in depth into any of them, but one headline that you might have seen recently, the Bay Area was recently declared a humanitarian crisis for the level of homelessness that's there. So this is one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced places in the world, where there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of desire to solve problems like this, and yet we see crisis level of homelessness showing up. So we're not able to meet a basic need that's as old as the species itself, even in this context. So why are we here? How did we end up in this situation? The reality is it kind of depends on who you ask. You'll get a lot of different answers, and you can open just about any newspaper or magazine and find someone pointing to one of these as the one problem that's causing everything. And really what we believe is that all of these are sitting on top of something a little bit more fundamental. And to talk about that and really what we're seeing and the opportunity we're seeing, I'm first going to talk about Vermont. So I lived in Vermont for a number of years, and I get some strange looks when I say this, but Vermont actually played kind of a formative role in how I think about cities and what it means to live in a city. And the reason for that is, well, a lot of Vermont looks like this, a lot of Vermont also looks like this. That Vermont has these villages that function almost kind of like these micro-cities. So what I mean by that is they exist at a density where there's a need to share space and resources, and that requires mechanisms for negotiating how those space and resources are going to be shared. In Vermont, these spaces also exist at a scale where it's possible to do that very directly. Vermont still observes town meeting day. It was about 2 weeks ago this year, where literally all businesses are shut down, and there is a meeting where the entire town gets into one room and they work out the business of the town. So that works reasonably well in the context of Vermont. And what it really represents is taking 3 different groups of the people who live there, the businesses and the governments that make up that space, and it puts them in one place. And it makes it pretty easy to build a shared understanding of what's happening, what are the problems facing the town, what are the opportunities, and what are we going to do about all of that. When we go back to cities, we're scaling up in a lot of different directions. We're scaling in terms of number of people, so we can't all fit in one room anymore, and it would be totally impractical even if we could. But we're also scaling in terms of amount of space, amount of resources, size of problems, and diversity. So all those different axes makes this dynamic instead look a little bit more like that. And what that means is that there are a lot of opportunities to miss shared understanding, and it's often not being built. So really the opportunity that we see is that we're missing a vital infrastructure for collaboration. Now, what do we mean by that? A vital infrastructure for collaboration, that means inclusive mechanisms for coming together to build that type of shared understanding that's being missed. So taking these 3 groups and making everyone feel like we're on the same page, we know what we're talking about. Okay, so where do we see this missing? Like, where is this showing up in the world? One example that you might have seen from the last year or so is bird scooters. So these are dockless electric scooters that kind of airdropped into a bunch of cities without much warning. And in this case, what happened is Bird did a pretty good job working with people. They built up a reasonably good following, and there were a number of individuals that were excited to use them, with some exceptions. You might have seen some headlines. But they didn't do a good job working with governments, the actual regulators, the people who control the streets that these scooters were going to show up on. So the result was they were very quickly banned from a lot of cities. Those who live in Boston might remember them being on these streets in Cambridge for about a week before they were removed. So it was really a failure to collaborate between all these 3 parties in how that was deployed. And what that represents, crucially, is a missed opportunity, right? That scooters are actually a pretty good mobility option. They're reasonably cheap. They can be really cheaply deployed in areas that might not have enough mobility solutions. And it's an opportunity that we entirely missed because the way that it was deployed wasn't collaborative. Another example that you almost certainly saw is Amazon entering New York City. In that case, what we saw is they worked very closely with the government and brokered a very clear deal, but they didn't really incorporate people into it. So this is another missed opportunity, right? That this is a lot of wealth and a lot of jobs that could have entered New York City if they had worked effectively with people to engage in that existing condition and really make it work for everyone who's involved and everyone who needs to share that space and resources. So really, in both of these cases and in many more, everyone is losing out. We're seeing people not getting these new services, these new opportunities. We're seeing businesses not able to provide these services, not able to profit off of providing those services. And we're seeing governments not able to provide these services and opportunities to their constituents. So how might we build the infrastructure for collaboration in today's cities? And luckily, I don't need to answer that question because Jeff's here to answer it for us.
Cool. Great. So one example of how this has actually worked pretty well is a case of Times Square in New York. So about 10 years ago, Mayor Bloomberg had created a plan for a greener, greater New York City and actually asked us to help make the city a more livable place. And so this notion that Parker mentioned about shared understanding, common experience, really formed our point of departure. And so the first thing we did is actually went out and measured what is called Times Square and found out there was no square there. That seems like pretty obvious, but the mayor and everyone else had actually never done the math and seen that about 90% of what was called Times Square was just road space. When we also measured how many people were going through there by car and by foot, we could see that 90% of the space was being taken up by only 10% of the traffic. So now we had a real clear, you might know Mayor Bloomberg also likes data and facts, right? So we had a real clear point of departure, a common understanding about what was going on in this space that gave sort of the political capital to make a pretty bold move and to establish a second point of common understanding. And that was, with this data in mind, we could actually close Broadway and roll out furniture essentially into the roadway of Broadway at Times Square. Immediately creating opportunity where citizens went out and stood in the middle of the street and could look up and say, wow, I have never seen the building from this perspective. I can have a seat here in the middle of Midtown. And rather than talking about traffic or anything else, they started complaining about the chairs not actually being good enough quality. So that shared understanding between citizens that if you went to a meeting and said, hey, we're thinking about closing Times Square, who's with us? Would say, not in a million years. We're now put in a situation with a common experience of what closing Times Square really meant and can now become more active sort of supporters of that change. So that first, very cheap prototype, essentially, provided that common understanding that then could evolve over time. So now we had businesses in the area wanting to go out and sponsor for upgrades to furniture or for paving material. We had government thinking about how to scale this up to other places. And citizens basically saying, hey, this is working quite well. So this one Times Square example created a process in which the city created a whole new program, the New York City Plaza program, that using this sort of approach was able to create 81 new plazas in the city in a place where you'd imagine there's no more space to be created, right? So 81 new plazas across the city in a really scalable format where the city could say, hey, we want to invest in a community, who wants one? That community had a chance to go out and work with private business, local stakeholders, and raise their hand essentially in a positive way and say, well, we would like a new square in our community. So thus really realigning the relationship between this triangle that we're talking about. Imagine if you think of your own community and home, there's very few opportunities for you as a citizen to say something positive that you want, right? To raise your hand in a positive way rather than just complaining. So what this concretely has meant, again, we've been able to quantify the benefits for people, safer, easier to walk, for government, actually seeing that the work that they're doing is having a positive impact in the community, and for business, bottom line saying, hey, if you have a business close to one of these areas, decrease commercial vacancy, increase rents, the ultimate kind of win-win-win that we talked about at the beginning, right? So you can go back to these examples and imagine, well, if Bird was actually framing their value proposition about green mobility, about something that the city wanted, and if the city had an established platform for groups like Bird to experiment, we could be in a totally different situation. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The same with Amazon. If Amazon was more open and honest about their huge impact in a community and saying, hey, 25,000 jobs has got a lot of upside, but also some risk. If they came to the table that way, and if the city also provided a constructive platform for Amazon to engage with those citizens, we could have had a much different situation. So basically what we're trying to say is these incredibly challenging problems, if we find that collaborative infrastructure, those ways to get shared understanding, common experience, then we can actually really take advantage of the potential down below that Parker was mentioning. That's about shifting some of the roles that people have, giving citizens more agency and control, getting businesses a chance to bring good products to market faster, and allowing governments more capacity to basically do more with less. And that's the general framework in which we want to talk about the hard problems in the city's portfolio. And this is step one of defining the problems that are most important for you all.